It's not calling you Josh Frydenberg, it's calling you Dosh Frydenberg.
Under the coalition, taxes for hard-working Australians will always be lower.
You know, I don't hold a hose, mate, and I don't sit in the control room.
They're answers that only can come from Victoria, I'm afraid, because that's not my job.
But I ain't spending any time, though, because in the meantime, every 3 months, a person is torn to pieces by a crocodile in North Queensland.
Well, g'day listeners, and welcome once again to the Two Jacks. It is episode 50. We've actually been on air for a lot longer than that, but this is the 50th episode of our pod where we combine world events and matters occurring in Australia. And joining me, as usual, in Hong Kong, happy 50th pod, Jack.
Does that mean we get to raise the bat and show the maker's mark?
Yeah, only just a little bit. It's only 50, mate. It's only 50. But you've got another public holiday in Hong Kong. What's it all about today, Jack?
Chung Yung Festival. I'm not sure. I just think it's a public holiday, but it's something to do with you walk up a mountain and drink chrysanthemum tea.
Do you do that? Have you done that?
No.
But that's what the locals will be doing today.
Well, some of them will. Generally, they'll be shopping.
Right. Well, we don't have any construction noise in the background. We do apologise to our listeners in the last couple of episodes. One of them was very, very bad from me. I had incoming scam calls that I just simply couldn't get rid of. And I do apologise for that. A little bit of construction noise, but no construction noise in Hong Kong today, as it's one of the many public holidays enjoyed by the Hongkonese. Sad news, Jack, with the death at 90 of Bill Hayden, an absolute giant of the Labor Party.
He was.
There's no doubt about that. He was a Queensland police officer. He studied economics at night, a member for Oxley for many, many years, not quite... handed the baton over to Pauline Hanson, but Hanson became the member for Oxley, didn't she, at some point?
She did.
So a Queensland Labor giant. He was the Minister for Health and then Treasurer in the Whitlam Government, the third Treasurer in the Whitlam Government, and a man who handed down an excellent budget in 75, Jack.
He did. He tried to rescue the failures of the Whitlam government from its failures, but it was too late.
It might have been too late, but there was a sense too that Fraser and the coalition opposition were very keen not to let that budget through, Jack, because it might have repaired some of the financial issues that had arisen during the Whitlam government.
Or at least given people some faith that they were being addressed, yes.
He became the leader of the opposition following the 1977 election, which, Fraser and the Libs won in 1975 by a landslide. And then it even got worse in 77, Jack.
It did.
And Gough left the stage and Bill Hayden became leader of the opposition for 6 years, almost 6 years, in fact. And then he got very, very close in 1980, and then he was thwarted in his attempt to become Prime Minister in 1983, the drover's dog election, Jack.
Yes, in the end, as I think Paul Keating put it in his statement on Bill Hayden's death, the choice was between Bill could possibly win the election and Bob Hawke almost certainly would.
And that's the way Labor went. There's some rather lovely stories about John Button in particular running around and he was a very, very close friend and ally of Bill Hayden's, and he was the one who had to basically be the moderator between the Hawke camp and the Hayden camp, of which Keating was a member. And Button tells a story in one of his wonderful books that he came across Bob Hawke in Sandringham He was out the back by the swimming pool on the Banana Lounge. That's the Fairfax swimming pool, I believe Hawke used to refer to it as, because he got it built with money he got from a defo. And it was John Button's job to tell him that the deal was done, provided that Bill Hayden would become foreign minister in the Hawke government, which duly occurred. But I remember John Button saying that Hawke was applying the sunscreen. In fact, it wasn't sunscreen; it was sun lotion, so liberally that he looked like a well-basted turkey, Jack.
Yes, I have heard that story. A lot of stories about the Hayden resigning. My recollection is that I think Hayden flew to Brisbane. Button flew to Brisbane with Lionel Bowen and Don Grimes, I think, who are also relatively close to Bill Hayden.
Grimes is the one I was thinking of, yes.
And he was persuaded to resign, but he did extract a written deal from Hawke. In fact, I think Troy Bramston from the Australian might have unearthed this a copy of this letter. And the letter required Hawke to guarantee that Hayden's staff would be found new jobs, and John Dawkins, Peter Walsh and Neil Blewett would remain shadow ministers, and that Hayden would be Minister for Foreign Affairs if they won the election, and that if he wanted to, he could have 5 years as High Commissioner in London.
He obviously rejected that offer. He was, in fact, Minister for Foreign Affairs for I believe about 3 years, and then he resigned from parliamentary politics and took up the position of Governor General, Jack, which he did with great aplomb.
He did. Whether Hayden famously said, look, a drover's dog would have won that election. I don't think it was ever quite as clear as that. I think Keating's assessment's right. Hayden was a possibility. Hawke was a near certainty. What Hayden did leave behind, though, is he'd done a lot of really good work in setting up, in repairing the damage that was done by Whitlam's period in government, both to Labor's reputation as economic managers and by putting the right people in place to manage the economy better if they got back into power. And Hawke inherited that.
There's a very famous Tandberg cartoon, Jack, of Malcolm Fraser calling the election. It was called early, and he said, "Hey, Bill, we've got an election on," and the voice came back. Yes, it's not Bill, it's Bob. And then there was Fraser with the pants down, which was eerily prescient, Jack, because he did in fact get caught with the trousers missing. Not just down, but missing in the States some years later.
Who hasn't misplaced a pair of trousers when you are
not while wearing them? Not while wearing them. I mean, look, you can misplace them, but generally not when you're wearing them. Laurie Oakes said this, the great doyen of political journalists: "They don't come much better than Bill Hayden. He would have made a great PM. Inheriting Bill's policies and the people he'd put in key roles gave Hawke a head start. A politician in the finest Labor tradition, humble, decent, clever, game as they come. Bill's contribution was immense."
I don't often give Peter Fitzsimons a plug, but I will on this occasion. On social media the other day, he recalled being at one of the Mirage resorts in Queensland while Bill Hayden was Governor General. And he arrived at breakfast one morning to find a queue of about 20 or 30 people lined up to get their spot at breakfast. And number 21 and 22 were Bill Hayden and Dallas Hayden, his wife. He was being encouraged by the staff to skip the queue, and he would have none of it. He was waiting in line just like everybody else.
Yes, a very fine Labor man and a person who brought great credit to the party through his a sense of economic management. He was very, very close to Paul Keating through that transition period into the Hawke government. And he He did basically everything well throughout his life, throughout his political life. Like many Labor people of that era, they weren't career politicians, Jack. They had lived lives before politics, and Bill Hayden's case with the Queensland Police, and then with all the heavy lifting he had to do there, he managed to do an economics degree at night. They don't make them like that anymore, mate, do they?
No, I think just about the only career politician from those days was Keating himself, who kind of left school at 15 to sort of start a political career. But they were rare. Almost all of them had done something else.
All right, now, what's the wash-up on the Voice, Jack? There's, I'd have to say, there's been a fair amount of hubris from the no camp, hasn't there? I don't know if you read Chris Kenny's column on Saturday. Did you ever look at that?
I did. Read part of it. It was a hard read.
I like him. I found it a bit much now that, given that the referendum has failed, that those in the no case, it includes Tony Abbott. Tony Abbott now wants us to dispense with the Indigenous flag, with the Aboriginal flag, and presumably the Torres Strait Islander flag as well. I read his piece during the week. The referendum doesn't hold any clauses like that, does it? I mean, why are we now stripping back on reconciliation, Jack?
No, I don't. I just, as often is the case, I didn't agree with much of what Tony Abbott had to say. I think there is a point about the acknowledgements and welcome to countries just being a little bit overdone. People who told me they were going to vote no, as an aside, would often say, "Look, we're fed up with that. It's just being, it's just too much of it." No, not the flag. No.
So now Anthony Albanese, according to Tony Abbott, shouldn't bookmark the Australian flag with the Aboriginal flag and the Torres Strait Islander flag. I mean, we weren't voting on that, were we?
No, I don't think people care much about that. As I say, there is a body of opinion that perhaps we could not stop the welcoming and acknowledgement of country, just wind them back a little bit, make them a little bit less ubiquitous.
All right, and the flag should stay as it is. And I did enjoy Chris's nice little slap there for Tony Abbott, because he said, we must remember there's the Union Jack sitting in the left-hand corner of ours. He doesn't seem to have any problem with that. Meanwhile, though, in Jack, Queensland, the Queensland public servants have been offered 5 days of paid leave if they are suffering from psychological distress following the failed Voice referendum. Is that true?
Yes, it is true.
Seems very strange. Melbourne's La Trobe University will allow Indigenous staff to take off the first working day following the referendum as well, but that's just a day. This is a week, Jack.
Yeah. I just thought I'd throw in your old university there. There's a lot of people on social media who frankly need a lot more than a week and a lot of counselling.
Well, Twitter said there's a tweet here. It's amazing how little introspection the Yes voters are doing on themselves and their efforts, which after the efforts that failed. That doesn't even make any sense, Jack.
I was on Twitter earlier this morning, and 2 or 3 people who I had followed during the referendum, because they were virulent Yes people, were calling out all and sundry and bewildered as to why they had lost. And if anybody, people were trying to engage with them and say, well, have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? And the response inevitably was, that's just a lie. You're all liars, So there are some people who are struggling to come to terms with the result.
Well, Frank Brennan has had a bit of a look at that, and he said he wrote at Anthony Albanese's news conference acknowledging the loss of the referendum, a journalist asked, why do you think Australians voted no? The Prime Minister's answer could not have been simpler. The analysis will go on for some time, no doubt, but the truth is that no referendum has succeeded in this country without bipartisan support. That's really not much need. There's really not much need for further analysis than that. We all knew that from day one, putting his all into his bold election commitment to implement the Uluru Statement from the heart and full. Albanese thought it worth a shot without bipartisan support. Many of us were not convinced, with Labor having lost 24 of the 25 referendum proposals it had put up since Federation. Bipartisanship was missing, of course, and I think it's a fantasy to consider that it was a possibility at any stage. Ken Wyatt had run as Indigenous Affairs Minister, and a member of Cabinet had actually run this across the Morrison and Turnbull governments and was rejected both times.
Yes.
The Libs were never going to come at this, were they?
Yeah, Frank Brennan is right to say that bipartisanship is a necessary thing to win a referendum, but he stops there, and he shouldn't stop there. Bipartisanship on its own doesn't doesn't guarantee you success. My view is that even if the Liberals had supported this, it would still have failed. And the reason I say that is 40% of Labor voters voted no.
Yeah, well, we'll never know. George Williams was in the Australian today, Jack, saying that referenda in this country virtually can't succeed anyway, given the restraints, the double majority. It's most unusual when they do get up, and George's view was that we needed to approach this in a different way outside of a referendum.
I think,
and more, not just a voice, but more general, any sort of constitutional reform.
I think that a lot of the problems that the proponents of the voice were trying to solve would have been better solved by non-referendum options. But I don't agree that referendums are impossible to pass. They're hard to pass. And what you need to do is to have a long process where you find out what is acceptable to most Australians, and that they will live with and that they will support. That takes time and patience, and that's the only way you can get it done.
All right. Well, for a bit of analysis around, from the commentariat around potentially sort of electoral consequences, Paul Kelly wrote this in The Australian. Out of 151 federal electorates, only 32 delivered a yes vote, but they were defined by high income earners, the professional class, people of influence and power, and young people. This is a world of progressive social conscience and conviction. The yes seats were in the inner cities, the affluent suburbs, Sydney's eastern suburbs, the entire North Shore, Melbourne's pro-green inner city, its well-off electorates, Kooyong and Goldstein, and most conspicuously in the high-income governing class in the ACT. This is what we talked about in the wake of the last federal election, that there was a profound shift in demographics, firstly around age, and then around what we might call the professional classes, high income earners. Jack, and certainly we would look at this from a point of view of, well, can the coalition can they regain Kooyong and Goldstein? It would seem very unlikely now.
It was unlikely before. It was unlikely they could get them back quickly, and that was unlikely before the referendum was called. But it's more unlikely now. Not much more.
You really get one chance when an independent takes a party, a major political party seat away from them. You get one chance, and that's the next election, and then basically you wait until those independent MPs retire, Jack.
Yeah, I think this situation might be a little bit different to that, but they were unlikely to get them back straight away, and they're marginally less likely to get them back post-referendum.
The Guardian has come out and said getting Dutton on board would have involved the government finding a model that could be supported by both Jacinta Price, and the Indigenous leaders who had crafted the Uluru Statement, particularly Megan Davis. And it goes on to say, in the real world, this seemed a stretch, to put it mildly, and that would seem to be fairly difficult sort of arrangement to make. So really,
the thing I think is missing in the Guardian's article is at no stage do they consider consulting anybody else apart from other politicians. What they should have been consulting was with the wider community to find a proposition that a majority of Australians could support. And if they'd done that, they might have succeeded.
Sticking with the commentariat, Michelle Grattan says, given that around 6 in 10 people voted no, former Labor power broker Graham Richardson is almost certainly right when he said this week, there was never a time when there was a glimmer of hope that this could get through. It's pretty much your position, Jack. To blame
It's always a nice thing to have a political judgment franked by Richard because he's a very, very astute political observer. But that's how honestly it seemed to me right from the beginning. I couldn't see it winning.
Michelle goes on to say, to blame lack of bipartisanship, disinformation and racism is kidding ourselves. The margin was too wide. You have to agree with that. I have to agree with that. To think Peter Dutton's support could have swung things is a very long stretch. Again, that tends to agree with your position. The Conservatives would have been divided, whatever Dutton did. And finally, Jack, to Waleed Ali, on the project, he said it ends up being the elite argument. The more elite sector of society, the more likely you were to vote yes, he explained. The biggest dividing line seems to have been education. If you're in a seat with high levels of tertiary education, bachelor or post, you're at the very top end of the yes vote. If you had the lowest levels of socio-education, you were at the low end of the yes vote. That's not to say people who were educated know what they're doing and people who don't have tertiary education don't. That's a new subclass that Waleed's just created there. Lowest levels of socio-education.
Yeah, I wasn't sure exactly what it meant.
What does it mean? What does it mean?
I've got no idea. People have done a booth-by-booth analysis of these things, and even within the no seats, which is almost all of them, you can find pockets of, small pockets of yes votes, and those small pockets of yes votes are the areas that I know, because I know them, most closely resemble inner Melbourne or the North Shore or the eastern suburbs of Sydney, inner Sydney. They're full of professional class people, I suppose.
But you maintain that this will have little, if any, consequences for the two major political parties going forward.
Yeah, I do. I've said that all along. I never thought it was much I don't think it was going to be decided by political parties, and nor do I think it's going to have a huge effect on the electoral prospects of either political party. People, particularly in the no seats, the 40% of Labor voters who voted no, they at least are smart enough to say, well, look, we didn't like the referendum proposal, so we voted against it. But that doesn't mean we want to vote Liberal at the next election.
Well, Cos Samaras from Redcliffe Polling is saying the Liberals are taking on all the wrong lessons from the referendum result, and I couldn't agree more with that. It will hurt them in seats they lost in 2022. Voters in the majority voted no on what was being proposed, conflating it to something larger when it comes to Aboriginal policy, like Tony Abbott and the flag, is simplistic. He goes on to say, as we just discussed, Kuyon and Goldstein just got a lot harder. At a state level, over 60% of booths in Hawthorn voted yes. That's over 18% higher than the Victorian Liberal leader secured in his seat in the same booths last year, and goes on to point out that the yes vote was very strong in the Sydney Teal seats as well. So
that says something. It says something nice about the no voters. They're smart enough to work out that it's a different process. That because you vote no in the referendum doesn't mean you vote Liberal in the election. It says something less flattering about the people in the North Shore and the eastern suburbs who aren't smart enough to say.
Aren't they entitled to their opinions?
Yeah,
or would you have preferred 100% no vote?
No, what I'm saying is I think the Liberals will be punished because the yes people won't just say, oh, well, that was the referendum and we'll move on to electoral politics, which is a different thing. They'll say, we want to punish the Liberals for for pushing a no vote.
I would say, just in concluding, wrapping this topic up for the week, I would think hubris will be the killer. And when we start seeing, and I noticed a lot of this last week, we start seeing this in sort of general commentary that this is the beginning of the end of the Labor government. I just think that's an absolute nonsense. And worse, if the Conservatives, and they tend to this anyway, they tend to hubris whenever they have a win, and they haven't had many in recent times. That sort of hubris, let's go a little bit further. Peter Dutton's call for a royal commission into child sexual abuse in Indigenous and remote communities, which is just a victim-blaming exercise if ever you've seen one. And most recently, he rejected, his decline to advance another referendum, Jack, just simply on constitutional recognition. Now, that's probably the smart move, but it's very different to what he was saying before the referendum.
Yeah, hubris is often a killer in politics, and hubris led us to this situation. The government thought they could push this through without wide support and without bipartisanship. That's hubris at its best, if you like. But everyone makes mistakes. It's what you do next that matters. And that's up to both parties now to get this right. The first thing you do when you lose is to ask yourself, what did we get wrong? Don't go run around blaming everybody else, blame the media, blame Rupert Murdoch, etc. Say, what did we get wrong? Why did we lose? This is true in sport and it's true in politics. But the worst thing you can do is just to tell yourself the wrong thing, as you suggest the Liberals might be doing. It's early days yet, but to tell themselves that this proves that they're better at everything, and it doesn't prove that at all. They didn't defeat this election. The people defeated this. They didn't defeat this referendum. The referendum lost because people didn't support it.
I saw, in terms of hubris, I've seen Dutton, we've mentioned Abbott, Michaelia Cash is another one. And now, of course, Peter Dutton is awaiting policies that he's going to consult with Jacinta Price, essentially. So that's his voice now. That's the voice now, Jacinta Price. My main concern is that we will start victimising Indigenous Australians through policies now that say, well, we're not, these little things like Abbott suggested, getting rid of the flag and these sorts of things, that we will go backwards in terms of reconciliation. And yes, we can point fingers of blame all over the place, but if that is the net effect around Australia, then it's been a complete disaster.
Well, what we need to have is an honest conversation about what's gone wrong for 40 or 50 years, particularly in remote Indigenous communities. And that means everything on the table. It means cultural practices, everything. Why are these things not working? What can we do better? What can we learn from the 40 or 50% of Indigenous Australians who are not disadvantaged, who are successful, who are living in the cities, etc., etc.? What can we learn from that experience to help the remote Indigenous communities? And everything should be on the table, and it should be an open and honest conversation. No saying, well, you got this wrong 10 years ago and you got that wrong 20 years ago. Let's start from today and say, what can we do now?
That's where I think the Liberals' audit is going, Jack. And there was some nonsense written about Noel Pearson, that he should face criminal charges over defrauding the Commonwealth over grants and this sort of thing. That's not coming from the opposition. That's coming from the fringe, by the way. And we just need to avoid this becoming a blame shifting exercise that focuses on Indigenous Australians generally and those in remote areas specifically.
Yeah, but we've got to start from the base.
I don't think there's any appetite for this anymore, Jack. That's the problem.
We have to start from the base point. Is we know that a lot of money's been wasted. We know that everything we've tried to do hasn't worked. Let's just accept that. Doesn't matter whose fault it is. That's just where we are. But where we go from here is what matters, is what can we do now to make it better?
All right, moving on now to the big story around the world, and that's Israel and Gaza. No ground war as yet, Jack. We've talked about some of the problems that the IDF might face with a ground war. Everyone else in the Middle East sort of sitting off and waiting to see what happens. Frequent airstrikes into Gaza and missile attacks coming that way. Of course, the hospital, of course, in Gaza was bombed with a huge amount of casualties, and we still don't know who fired the round that destroyed all those lives. The Israelis maintain it was a misfire of a Hamas a missile. Hamas, of course, believe it was an Israeli airstrike. Joe Biden, US president, has taken the Israeli side on that and looked at some of the intelligence that we wouldn't have at our disposal. I did look at some of it, Jack. Have you seen anything? Did you look at the footage of the missile fires and the one that got away?
And of the damage to the hospital, et cetera, et cetera. It seemed unlikely from the photos I saw that it was anything like what Hamas was saying. But there you go. But there's always stuff that we don't get to see. So
there's always, that's exactly right. And in that there was a volley of rockets set off from northern Gaza, and one you can see missed. But these missiles have, I would say, limited explosive capabilities in terms of causing that sort of damage on a hospital. Again, it's impossible to know who to believe at this stage. But the fallout around the world, Jack, there was a big march in Sydney on the weekend. Attendees stretched from the steps of Town Hall along the tram tracks of George Street in the city centre, chanting "Free, Free Palestine" and "Shame, Shame Albanese." But really, it was a fairly quiet and gentle. I listened to a number of the speakers there who were denouncing racism, denouncing anti-Semitism. It seemed to me to be a fairly good measure of people. Again, I want to talk about electoral prospects. I know this is an awful war with innocents are being killed on a daily basis. But is there a problem that there might be for Albanese in Western Sydney?
There's probably a problem for left politics around the world with this, because the fringe end of the left have thrown in there a lot with Hamas. It's sort of an extraordinary collaboration, if you like, really, because all the things that the extreme left propose to hold dear, Hamas is virulently opposed to.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. What I'm getting at is the discussion on them. And the Labor government has a two-state solution, so it supports the establishment of a Palestinian homeland, but with the ethnic makeup of Western Sydney, might Albanese face some real problems of his own domestically?
Yes. One of the things I think is extraordinary about the politics of this is that I don't believe that people like Jason Clare, Tony Burke, Chris Bowen, all of these people, Ed Husick, etc.
With Western Sydney electorates.
Sydney, Richard Miles in Corio. I expect every last one of those knew that a resounding no vote was coming, right? And knew that, like Graham Richardson, they thought this had little chance of success from a long way out, right? And I don't believe that none of them sat down with Anthony Albanese and said, Prime Minister, this is going badly. I just don't think that's possible. I think somebody somewhere, maybe not in cabinet, But someone somewhere has had a chat to Elbow and said, we need to rethink this. And yet it didn't happen. So that gives him an internal political problem, I think, in the Labor Party, because I think his standing with his colleagues is diminished because he got this wrong.
Well, that's the voice. But what I'm talking about now is Labor's, the Albanese government's support for a two-state solution, but also support. We hear the rallying chant of "Shame, Albanese, shame."
Yep.
Will there be a significant backlash for those people like Chris Bowen, Ed Husic, etc.?
And much of those same politicians have a large part of their electorate who don't believe in a two-state solution. That's why they chant free Palestine from the river to the sea. Anyone with a basic understanding of geography and politics knows what that means is the complete destruction of the state of Israel. Right. There is no other meaning for that chant.
Well, I guess if you were a pro-Palestinian living in Western Sydney, Jack, you might look at both major parties and say, well, there's nothing much to be gained here.
Yeah. That's right. They're going to find themselves with more in common with the Greens, because that's basically the Greens' position. The Greens purport to say that they want a two-state solution, but they don't really. They want Israel gone. So that's a problem, not just in Australia, but it's
they
around
don't
the
actually
world.
say that, but you're actually right. I mean, Jenny Leong's stuff. I mean, firstly, there was the Hamas attack, which led to the deaths of over 1,000 people, more than 150 people taken hostage. There were, I believe, 2 American hostages returned over the weekend, but the large body of them remain captive. Jenny Leong didn't even look at some of the worst outrages before she basically just assumed the Hamas position. It was really awful, Jack.
Well, people were protesting about Israel while Hamas was still killing Israelis. Before the killing was over,
and then she
people were
doubled
protesting
down
about
again.
Israel.
Yeah, and then she doubled down again, and it was so for me. This is a conflict where you cannot afford to take sides. As an observer, and we're not talking about governments, the US or Australia, but as an observer, this is one that where you find it very, very difficult to take sides. I mean, both sides are indiscriminate in terms of who they target, and that leads to the loss of innocent lives, civilians, children, women. Taking a side here, it just seems to me to be a very, very odd thing to do.
I'm generally on the side of the Western liberal democracies in these situations.
Now, that might be the case, and I fully understand your position. But at the same time, there's going to be some great ugliness. There's already a lot of it has already occurred, and a great deal is to come if we listen to the IDF's leaders and talk about how they're going to destroy Hamas once and for all, and they'll just leave this very small strip of land. I believe there are also bombings in the West Bank today, Jack.
And in Syria, etc. Syria,
Well, let's get to, rather than looking
in the immediate
at cheap
aftermath
stuff about political affiliation. What is the prospect of this becoming a broader conflict?
There is some prospect of that.
Very serious, I would say, very serious possibilities. Iran is sitting by and watching. There have been bombings in Lebanon and the Golan Heights, as you say, bombings in Syria. And when you look at the way this is established with the US supporting Israel, and you've got on the other side, essentially, and historically this pans out in the old days of the Soviet Union has always been pro-Arab. So we do have this sort of potential for superpower conflict.
The US. I think I've sent a second carrier group to the area now
Yes.
to rattle the cage of that. There's a lot of emotion about this, and I can understand that. But generally speaking, I think Israel's got the right to defend itself. I want to see Israel survive. As I say, I'm generally on the side of Western liberal democracies. It is one. It's the only one it's the only country in the area that any sane person would want to live in.
Yeah. Okay. Well, have you been looking much?
Can I say this before
have you
go
been
on?
looking much at Saudi reports? Have you been looking much at what's going on in the Emirates? Because it's like it's not. If you do, you'll find it's like nothing is occurring in Gaza.
Yeah, because they don't support the Palestinians at all. Almost no one in the Arab world will take. There'll be no Arab country that will take Palestinian refugees. Guarantee you that. Just while we look at the West and the West reaction, there was a hell of a lot of, people were lighting up buildings in the colours of the Israeli flags and all that sort of stuff, right? And even at the time, you could see this wasn't going to last. The We Stand With Israel thing wasn't going to survive when the Israel had to take some tough action, and they do have to take some tough action. It's going to get ugly, right? It's going to get hard to support Israel, and they were never going to keep doing that. That was just performative nonsense.
Yes, you did say at the time, Jack, it's going to be hard to keep supporting Israel.
Yes.
And that's what you meant at the time. Yes. Yep. The response to killing over 1,000 people, most of them innocent civilians, by Hamas, there was always going to be a huge reaction, a huge military response there. Is Israel and the IDF looking at perhaps not engaging in a ground war in Gaza? Because the first thing I'd say from my little bit of study into the IDF is its numbers are down. I mean, I know there have been 300,000 reservists called up, but its numbers have been down compared to historic levels, and there's certainly talk around the morale of the IDF, I also believe that once you do engage in a ground war, basically anything goes on the table at that stage. Things can change very, very quickly in terms of broadening the conflict regional and possibly even global. So is there, do you think, some hesitation about a ground war from the IDF?
Well, I think there'd be quite a lot. I mean, they don't want to. They don't want a Stalingrad situation.
They will walk into an environment that is deeply hostile. Yeah, well reinforced positions.
They will only move on that if they're confident that they can pull it off. And to the Hamas supporters out there, I'd say, just tell Hamas to release all those civilian hostages unharmed. That might improve your cause a little bit. Because we seem to have forgotten about that.
About 150 to go. I would think that would be a major step in the right direction.
If indeed you Hamas supporters are sincere about this, get on social media, get in the newspapers and start telling Hamas to release the hostages.
Yes, I would think that would be a major step in the right direction, Jack. Meanwhile, around the world, protests throughout the West, in the EU and Europe and the UK, large numbers, clashes with police. In Berlin, at least 70 police officers were injured and 200 protesters arrested. Numerous vehicles burned, Molotov cocktails thrown, and various destructions around the place. And the Met had to issue a notice about the word jihad, Jack.
The policing, I watched quite a lot of videos of this. I haven't seen policing, the policing in Germany and the Netherlands and in France in particular, Jack, I haven't seen policing like this for a long, long time.
Well, the old baton charges, Jack. Going back to the old baton charges.
Not just the baton charges. When they arrest someone, there's a couple of cut lunches thrown. If the bloke goes to the deck, the slipper goes straight in, hasn't been seen in the UK or Australia forever, I don't think. Or it seems like forever. But the police force in the UK are completely different to that. They're even finding excuses for people calling for jihad. So there you go.
So this is Hizb ut-Tahrir, which has been an Islamic group that has been faced a lot of criticism in Australia. It has a strong base in Western Sydney, and the use of jihad, the use of the term jihad was put about by Hizb ut-Tahrir, but the London Met says that's okay.
Yeah, we were talking before about the politics in Australia too. I forgot to mention this, but where I think it breaks down is that from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free crowd, that is destruction of Israel. That's nowhere near. It's a significant minority around the West and the world, but nowhere near a majority. Most people don't believe that, I don't think, right? So that gives the progressive parties some difficulty because they've got a chunk of the party who's calling for something that they can't sell to the wider electorate.
Right. But in regard to the London Met and what you describe as a sort of a softly approach from police there was some issues, so some tweets sent out. One that said that there is going to be a counterforce in the West to this eruption of jihad support and no one is going to like it. Someone said, hate to say it, but I honestly think this is the beginning of the end for British Jews. That is awful and ominous. Another one saying, from a politically moderate Jewish student at an elite law school, I'm doing better right now than my Jewish friends on the left. They are truly adrift. They look around and see their lefty friends celebrating the massacre of Jews and they know that they are completely and utterly alone. Just break away from it for a moment and the conditional release
program... Can I just say that fits
just before you do, Jack, just before you do. The conditional release program has an interview with Yaakov Aron, an Israeli, a Jewish fellow living in Australia with a background in ultra-Orthodox religions. That interview with Joel will be up later this week. Go on, sorry, Joe. Go on,
sorry, I can't see you today. Those comments about the end of British Jewry and about what Jews around the world are thinking fits with what I'm hearing from Jewish friends, and they're on the WhatsApp all the time. Everybody knows somebody who knows somebody, or everybody's got some personal connection with the people who were killed. Everybody's feeling the pinch around the Western world. They no longer feel safe. It's a very, very, very bad situation for Jewry around the world.
Well, Justin Trudeau hasn't really helped, has he? He said, as members of the Palestinian, Arab and Black Muslim communities gathered for prayer yesterday, I wanted them to know this. That is Justin Trudeau, Canadian Prime Minister. We know you're worried and hurting. We're here for you. We will not stop advocating for civilians to be protected and for international law to be upheld. And that's okay. That's quite a good message. But what else did he mention Israel at all? In any of those
someone put up a response saying, anyone else hurting or murdered or kidnapped or tortured, etc., etc. Anyway, it's Justin.
Yeah. All right. Now, slightly more amusing stuff, Jack. We've got an election coming. There's still a fair way off. It must be held no later than January the 28th, 2025 in the UK, where they have more or less fixed 5-year terms. And there was a by-election there over the weekend or
two by-elections.
Last week. Yeah, two. Sorry, yes, that's right. Labor gained mid-beds, which was vacated in the northern summer by Tory ex-cabinet minister Nadine Dorries. The red wall looks like it's being put together brick by brick, Jack.
Yes, More than that, Tories are
They're stunning results. Yeah,
it's a 20% swing, and the Tories think that even previously safe Tory seats are now at risk.
Well, yes. I mean, when we talk about the Red Wall, I mean, Mid-Beds, the seat of Mid-Beds, Labor has never won it in 105 years, Jack, and it's got it now. It's a mid-Bedfordshire for anyone who's looking at it. This Labor shadow cabinet minister Peter Kyle issued this statement nailing by that particular by-election result, mid-Bedfordshire, as a political earthquake. And he said, "This is the biggest by-election shock in history. It is a political earthquake, and it is one that is sending an unignorable message to Westminster and to Rishi Sunak that this country deserves better." So, yeah. Yes. Where was the other one? Victory for Labor in Brexit backing Tamworth saw the party overturn the Tories' 19,000 vote majority from the 2019 general election. What can the Tories do, Jack?
Well, one thing we should just point out is that it was a turnout issue in large part for the Tories. Labor won Staffordshire with just 811 votes more than they recorded last time. 2/3 of the Tory voters from last time stayed home.
Didn't turn up.
Yep.
Just didn't turn up. Well, we'll get to what can the Tories do in a minute. I just asked you, but what they seem to be doing, from my reading, is that they seem to be going on this mad culture war pursuit, Jack, as if that's a sort of a good strategy for them. You know, there were a number of cabinet ministers who talked about, well, we'll get rid of the meat tax. Well, there is no meat tax. We'll get rid of all this sort of woke nonsense that doesn't exist. So that's a strategy that is not going to play well during an election. Can they do anything? I suspect they're just going to be blasted out of power, in huge numbers when that election finally comes. It'll probably be sometime late next year.
Almost certainly they'll lose. The only risk for Labor is that it faces that very internal problem that we were talking about that Labor in Australia faces in Western Sydney. Only it's much worse for the UK.
Much more marked. You've still got Jeremy Corbyn and the Corbynites running around.
Well, Jeremy's out of the party, but the Corbynistas are still on the party.
Yeah, that's right.
And they are virulently pro-Hamas, and that is a
pro-Russia.
I don't think that can be sold to the wider community. Yeah,
they're pro-Putin.
Yes.
They'll tell you they're not, but what they're calling for would essentially mean the disintegration of Ukraine under the jackboot of Putin. Corbyn will always say, "Oh no, I spotted Putin before anybody else, and I think he's a wicked man." Well, don't support his policies. Don't support his invasion.
Yeah, there is a reason for their position. Is that part of the UK Labor Party is really anti-West. They're anti the Western world.
Yeah, they're anti-NATO. Anti-West definitely, but specifically anti-NATO.
Yeah, but it's a broader thing than that. Of course they're going to support Hamas. Why? Because Israel's really part of the Western world, and they hate it.
All right, back to the Tories' woes, Jack. One Tory MP with a majority over Labor of almost 20,000 in his partly rural, partly urban seat in southwest England said that virtually every Conservative-held area, however secure at elections past, was now up for grabs. You can't put any other gloss on it other than it is bloody awful, he said. The vast majority of us in safe seats are now in play. There may be colleagues who are in play who don't yet realise they are. There will be people in the stockbroker belt who could be at risk. I think I have got a fighting chance, but I won't be shocked if I don't win. There you go, Jack. Another Tory backbencher with a big majority in his northern seat was just as downcast. There is nothing Rishi can really do now other than to try to look competent and hope for the best. You can't admit that's not much of a strategy, but it's probably all they got. You can't admit that it is now just about minimising losses. You can't go out and say that, but that is where we are. Yeah.
Yeah. How long have they been in power? 13 years or something, isn't it? 13, 14 years?
Yeah.
I think they've run out of steam.
Oh, yeah. That seems very, very right to me. And the way they're playing it, I just can't believe it. They're saying, well, we've got rid of these taxes and we've done this and we've done that. And you go, hang on, you've been in power for 13 years. You can't blame the other side for failures here. You probably has, as that backbencher said, look competent and hope for the best.
Yeah, well, as always with these things, you've got to ask yourself what we got wrong, not what external forces aren't killing us. We're killing ourselves.
Well, they won't do any post-mortems until they're thrashed, but and they won't come to any reality. From what I've seen, they're playing this sort of woke culture war nonsense, and if you fall for that stuff, well, you need your head read. Meanwhile, Jack, in the United States, chaos within the Republican Party. They cannot come to terms with the Speaker, and you've got what do they call them? The Angry Eight. The Angry Eight, the ones who basically contrived with the Democratic Party to remove Kevin McCarthy, and now are being pointed at as the ones who basically are part of the problem in getting a new Speaker. Jim Jordan had 3 goes. He's now handed the baton over to someone else. Where's it going to end?
Well, I think there's a determination amongst the vast majority of Republicans in the Congress that whatever else happens, the 8 people should not be rewarded. They should not get their way. And if that means doing a deal with Hakeem Jeffries, the Democrat, to be the next Speaker, they will do that rather than give Matt Gaetz and his 7 cohort
the Angry Eight.
But they won't give them their way. It's a line in the sand. It's a line in the sand moment.
Gaetz is utter shambles. You just sort of wonder why he's still in politics. In the end, he was found not to have any charges brought against him for child prostitution and all sorts of other things. He's an absolute disaster. Massive trumper, of course. Massive disaster that he's been for the Republicans. And what long-term impact is this going to have?
You do understand where his electorate is, don't you?
Yeah, well, yeah, and no doubt he'll be re-elected. He's a Florida man, by the way, folks. And
Florida Panhandle, by the way. More
that's
precisely.
right. I think he's congressional number 1 in Florida, isn't he? He's the district number 1, which would be up in the Tallahassee area.
No. It's right. It's right down in the Redneck Riviera.
Oh, right down near Mobile, Alabama.
Yeah,
I see. So you think that there's a very strong prospect that a Democrat will become Speaker of the House?
That's a possibility, yes.
But what does this mean for the Republicans showing in the congressional election in 2024? I mean, it can't be good.
Not a lot, I expect. The general feeling of chaos won't help, but I suspect most Americans are paying this zero to little attention.
Well, when we look at the polling in the United States, Jack, we talk about approval ratings for Joe Biden and Donald Trump, and more often than not, they're in the negative. But when you look at Congress, how effective do you think the Congress is? I mean, there's about 85% who just think it should be thrown out. Huge numbers of Americans think their Parliament, their Congress, is failing them.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. That's one of the things that helped Trump get elected.
Yeah, of course it is. Yeah, the man without any sort of political baggage. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's not really helping him right now, though, is it, Jack? Because there have been Sidney Powell has not released a Kraken. She has decided a plea bargain, copped a handful of misdemeanors, pleaded guilty to those, and as has Kenneth Chesebro, which I think happened yesterday. He's indicated that he will flip as well. Those two were the first in the RICO. The first two in the 19 charged RICO offences in Fulton County, Georgia. Those two had requested a trial, and before that took place, now they've both flipped, Jack. They've got a gag order placed on them. They're not allowed to contact any of their co-accused in the RICO trial. They essentially will be required to give evidence on behalf of the prosecution. Now they become Crown witnesses in our terms. What does this mean for Donald Trump, Jack? He must be getting a little bit toey about this.
No, I think it means he's, if he gets re-elected, it'll be on the back of the legal cases against him.
Well, yeah, but let's just stick with what we're dealing with here. So certainly what we've got here is Fulton County, Georgia, RICO offences. You've got two flipping, and this is what happens with RICOs, right? And in Georgia, it's particularly marked. Georgia has 5-year minimum mandatory jail sentences for anyone convicted of a RICO offence. So that puts enormous pressure on the co-accused to flip, and we've already seen two flip. There's talk that there's one already flipped in the Florida matter over the secret and confidential documents prosecution. It looks more and more like come March this will be sorted, and if Trump is found guilty on the basis of Sidney Powell or Kenneth Chesebro or any one of the others, you will see, I'm going to tip you'll see at least 12 go. You'll see 12 roll of those indicted, and it may be more. So that isolates Trump. It means that people like Powell and Chesebro will be giving evidence against him, and it makes a conviction for the RICO offences more likely than not. And as I say before, convicted, 5-year minimum mandatory jail term.
Yeah. If he gets back into the White House, as I say, it'll be on the back of the choices that have been made. That's just straining. That's just straining credibility at the moment. Basically, we've got a very, very serious 4-count. And of course, Chesebro and Powell are both named in the federal indictment, the 4-count federal indictment. They're named as unindicted co-conspirators. So they may find themselves pleading, or they have pleaded guilty to misdemeanors in Georgia, but still find themselves potentially prosecutable in Washington, D.C. I mean, these trials will be the Georgia business goes to trial in March for Trump. The Washington, D.C. stuff goes to trial in the same month. If this is allowing Trump to become president, I mean, I think you're not dealing with what's going to happen first. And that is, if he's convicted in Georgia, he goes to jail minimum 5 years. Yeah,
if he's convicted on the 4 counts in DC, he's looking at 25 years.
I think a wide part of the American population don't have any faith in the prosecutions, don't have any faith in the legal proceedings, and there's a reason. I actually share part of that. I have a different view on RICO prosecutions to you. I'm glad we don't do that sort of thing in Australia. I think it's basically prosecutorial misconduct. And the only straightforward charges, the only straightforward, clear-cut, easy to understand for the American people charges are the ones in Florida, and he'll almost certainly get convicted on those down in Florida. The documents charges, but all the rest of it is going to look like someone politically putting their thumb on the scale.
Yeah, I'm not so sure about that. I mean, I think as the evidence comes out, I think we'll see a change of mind, because what Chesebro was actually provided the advice, the legal advice, was to create a suite of false electors which would overturn the result of the 2020 presidential election. And Mark Meadows, Trump's chief of staff, and Rudy Giuliani, his personal counsel, and Donald Trump himself would be, for mine, looking at very, very long jail terms. And the fix was in. They knew. And this is what people like Powell and Chesebro will be saying in court, in evidence against him before a jury. They'll be saying that he knew that he'd lost, but he continued to conspire with a number of people to overturn the election. That this wasn't just a simple, I'm not quite sure, let's check out the voting. This was a concerted effort to overturn the result of the 2020 presidential election. We've got to get through all that before we even get to these great questions of where, if Donald Trump ends up in prison, where they're going to put him, those sorts of things. What's going to happen in the election come November 2024? That we've got to deal with all of these things first.
Yeah, well, it's about politics in the end. It's going to be determined by, I think he'll be the Republican nominee, and I think every little bit of these legal trials helps him in the politics of it.
Yeah, I'm not so sure that once the extent of his knowledge and what he purported to do, what he was going to do with the advice of people like Kenneth Chesebro, is that he was basically going to overturn the election itself, the views of the people, and I think that will become clearer as we go. Anyway, moving over, Jack, very interesting story, and we've been sort of following these things on and off around the world. Fertilizer shortage. And it's particularly acute in Africa at the moment. It was the subject of a New York Times report, Jack, and which reads in part, since February 22, the price of fertiliser has more than doubled in Nigeria and 13 other African countries, according to a survey by ActionAid. Concern about food insecurity has been alarmingly high in much of West and Central Africa, according to a World Bank bulletin. Now, my understanding is, Jack, there are no facilities to create inorganic fertilisers anywhere in the continent of Africa. That's correct, isn't it? In fact,
I think that's right. Yes,
the Africans had wanted to do so, and the EU and other groups said, "Oh, yeah, no, it's a very good idea, but it's going to, of course, creating inorganic fertilisers creates a lot of emissions," and so it was put on hold there. And the net effect of that, Jack, is that in the end you have diminished crops, diminished crop yields, and Africa's ability to feed its population, which is always tenuous, becomes even worse.
Yes, and that's because the people in the EU don't really believe that inorganic fertilisers are a good idea. They'd like to stop their use. They're trying to do that within the EU. The problem with that is that there are 8 billion people in the world, and if we don't use inorganic fertilisers, we can probably feed about 5 or 6 billion of them.
Yeah, and the other 2 billion.
Well, they'll be.
Shall we just say uncertain futures, Jack?
Yes, yeah. And it's yet another bad green idea.
Yeah, it is. And so, look, the price of fertiliser too has been affected. And this is one of the stories that, in our early days, when we looked at specifically matters that were going on around the world, the Ukrainian conflict, the invasion of Ukraine. Ukraine and Russia are two of the greatest exporters of inorganic fertilizers, and that has been restricted.
Specifically urea.
That's more of a Chinese thing, I think. What we're talking about is phosphates, I believe. Yeah. And yes, the Chinese are big on urea, but and so that has created this shortage anyway. The Ukrainians' inability to export fertilizer, so the price is high. So we're actually seeing, perhaps, Jack, what might be coming down the road. We're actually getting a bit of a preview there. On what might happen. And if you don't have enough fertilisers, then you just don't get the crop yields to feed enough people.
Well, have a look at Sri Lanka for an example of what happens.
Yeah, that's exactly what happened. And just for anyone who doesn't know that story, the Sri Lankan government announced a ban on inorganic fertilisers. It just sprang it on their farmers, left them in terrible states. Sri Lanka had been self-sufficient in rice, so its major cash crop is tea. It is no longer self-sufficient in rice, so it has to import rice where it never had to. The ban was lifted, but too late, and you basically had two harvests where crops failed, where crop yields were well and truly down, and it's added considerably to woes within Sri Lanka, Jack.
Yeah, it's going to take a while to fix.
Yeah, well, just to revisit that just for a moment or two, we believe, certainly Sri Lanka's political environment has calmed down. They've come to some sort of debt arrangements with international banking, and I think we said on this on a previous show, if you're thinking about going somewhere and throwing a little bit of money around as a tourist, Sri Lanka would be a good place to go. Very cheap at the moment and a lovely, lovely place. But they're still battling with significant economic woes. All right, well, that takes us up to sport, Jack. And we've got a New Zealand punter has pulled off one of the greatest feats in horse racing history. Has he won something, Jack? Has he won a race? Oh, no, he's won $10 million from the TAB.
He did. He chose all 12 horses in the Everest in their finishing order.
Sounds easy.
This is a promotion put on by TAB to promote the Everest in New Zealand, because they for the first time they had a New Zealand horse in it. I Wish I Win, and he managed to plonk the 12 horses down in the right order in the finishing order, and the prize was $10 million.
Punters one shot at getting the correct order defied odds of 1 in 479 million, Jack.
Yeah, so the 10 million was unders, really,
He's won 10 million. Yes, I'm getting a little confused because the Everest is a $20 million horse race, but he's picked up the 10 million, and he's unders. Yeah, technically he should have been slung 800 million, Jack.
Yeah, it was something a bit more than 10.
But I'm sure he'd be happy enough. Look, what did you make of the Everest, Jack? I mean, there were probably five in the race that you'd think would a chance to win, and the other 7 no.
Yeah, I did my usual thing for a pal who bets more than I did, and gave him a list of 5, and the winner and the second one were in it. Look, I was a bit of a naysayer about the Everest when it was first announced. I wasn't sure that it would catch on, but it certainly has. It creates an immense amount of interest.
They projected the horses on the Opera House, Jack.
Yeah.
How could it not win? And you remember the controversy about that? By the
I
way?
do. Yeah, the first time they did it. Yeah.
It was, yes, those who owned in horse racing were particularly unamused. But is it the biggest race in Australia now, or is that still the title held by the Melbourne Cup? I suspect it's changing.
I think
it's
probably
changing.
the cup still holds that, but it certainly has changed the face of racing, particularly in Sydney.
Particularly in Sydney, that's right. And I also think that given the nature of the Melbourne Cup, 2 mile handicap, and given the nature of the Everest, which is like 1,400 metres, isn't it? 1,400?
1,200.
1,200, sorry, yeah. 1,200. You're going to see the best horses running around the Everest, best Australian horses and New Zealand horses running around the Everest than you are in Melbourne Cup with a 2 mile stay.
Well, we were going to talk about racing later on, but we'll deal with it now. The difference is that Australia breeds top quality sprinters, 1,200 metre horses, and our staying horses are not top quality. So Appel asked me for what I thought about the Caulfield Cup, and I gave him a list of 5 names, and the first 3 were all in it. And that's because what I look for is the horses from Europe or Japan they mightn't be A+ graders, but they're kind of A- or B+ graders, and that's good enough to beat most of the Australian horses.
Yeah, look, the Melbourne Cup. Everyone has a bet in the Melbourne Cup. Well, sort of 80% of the country has a little flutter on the Melbourne Cup. But the fact of the matter is that it's probably the hardest race to pick, and made more difficult. It's a 2 mile handicap with a large field, 24 horse field, so anything can happen. And the other thing is, as you say, most of the quality stayers are coming from overseas, and often they haven't had a run. More often than not, they haven't had a run in Australia, and it's incredibly difficult, made even more difficult than it might have been in 1975 to pick a winner in the Melbourne Cup.
Yeah, well, in the 1970s, the astute Australian trainers were going to New Zealand to buy up staying horses. These days, there are agents scouring around, including a couple that I know, scouring around. There's an Irish fellow and a French fellow that I know who make a living by bringing staying horses from Europe into Australia for the Cups.
Yeah. Well, look, we'll give you a little bit of inside stuff as we approach the spring carnival proper. We'll do all of that sort of next week and over the next couple. Jack, it's not far away, Melbourne Cup now, really isn't. First Tuesday in November. I think that makes it about the 7th.
That's right. Cox Plate Day this weekend. And if you want to, if you're having a bet on that, have a good look at Gold Trip.
There you go. You heard it from Jack. And if you don't want to have a bet, you can still listen to Darryl Braithwaite. He must just look forward to Cox Plate Day, Jack. It's just pretty much the only gig he gets these days now. Get up and sing the horses before the race. And the Cox Plate, I think they run at about 6 o'clock. 6 o'clock Melbourne time in order to expand its viewership around the national news. So if you're wondering why it's been run so late, that's why. Cricket World Cup, Jack. Australia's, like this time last week, the English were having a great big laugh at Australia, sitting down on the bottom of the table after losses to India and South Africa. Really did change things with Bull Warner just scoring a magnificent 160. I think the calls for his retirement have just slowed a little bit. 160 magnificent runs. Mitch Marsh put on 240 odd. And they got the job done against Pakistan. Warner's first 6 actually hit the top of the stand, and I just love him as a cricketer. But we'll go on. We'll talk about Dave in a minute because I've just got a lovely story about him. But Australia's World Cup is back on track. We play Holland now. We've beaten Pakistan. Who else did we roll, Jack? They've had a couple
we've gone
wins.
okay. Afghanistan beat England, I think, so a more momentous thing than anything we've done.
Sensational. And they didn't just beat them, Jack. They absolutely thumped them.
Yeah, beat them by 70-odd runs, I think, yeah.
And it looked very, very poor. It looks like they have, come into this tournament, England that is, come into this tournament very, very underdone. India beat New Zealand comfortably last night, despite a big 100 from Daryl Mitchell. And their batting just looks so solid, Jack. Obviously on home turf, very good conditions, and suitable conditions, but their batting just looks so strong. The great Kohli, Virat Kohli, got 100. And against New Zealand, just fell about 6 runs short from a second one for the tournament. I think he's in over 100. I'll have to check this. Some 100 ODI hundreds. But anyway, they look to be the strength in the competition. South Africa, you identified last week as being a bit of a smoky, and they've certainly come up again. They look like they are, tuned for this. So they are definitely in the 4. I think Australia are in the 4 now. Australia playing the Netherlands next. And one thing that's really good about this tournament is you've got no dead rubbers yet. You've got everyone's competing, and some have been found wanting, like England, Jack.
Yeah, Australia will probably fall into the 4, but I think South Africa have the best chance of beating India. But to be honest, everyone's going to be relying on finding India on a rare off day.
That's what you're looking at. I totally agree with that. You're just going to have to hope that you get through, and then India just you can skittle a few of them. Their bowling's so good too, mate. His bowling is so good. Bumrah is almost impossible to get away, and then they've got the best head of hair in cricket. Ajay Jadeja, who didn't get a wicket last night against New Zealand. You could almost see the batsman when he finished his 10-over spell just breathe a sigh of relief they didn't get out to him. A magnificent cricketer all round. Dropped a catch too, and that is something you never see. He's a brilliant field. And then, of course, World Cup-wise, we've got the Rugby World Cup final being played this weekend, Jack. And it's the ABs, the All Blacks versus South Africa, with the North not even having a sniff.
No. Again, an excellent semi-final. The South Africa England semi was a cracker. England led all night until a late penalty scrum, and the Pollard, the South African kicker, popped it over. As always, the South Africans have a tremendous scrum and a good kicker.
And the All Blacks disposed of Argentina pretty brutally
comfortably.
too.
Yeah, I had been hoping for an Ireland-France final because I'd like to see a new name on the cup.
Yeah, me too.
Rather than a rehash of. Well, the only countries who've won it have been New Zealand, Australia, South Africa, and England. So it would have been nice to see a new name go on there.
But who's got the better form going in there? I just, the demolition of Argentina probably tells you that they've just had New Zealand had a slightly easier run into the final than South Africa.
Well, they certainly had an easier semi. They both had very tough, very, very tough and very close wins in the quarterfinals. I've just got to think. I just think that South Africa will probably got them.
We have tipped them. I only tipped them because I just don't want to see the All Blacks win again. That's the only reason I'm coming up with that. All right, Jack, take us out with something silly.
That's very disloyal to your background. You are a part Kiwi.
Yeah, but it becomes a bit hard to bear, to New Zealanders about the All Blacks, and they'll just break into a. Have you seen the All Blacks? Have you seen what they've done? They just can't stop talking about it. It just gets irritating.
Yeah. A Kiwi fellow who I'd never met before, I met him a week or two ago, and he was telling me about the gracious All Blacks fans. And I said, are there really? I haven't met one yet.
Well, they're not horrible, but they are graceless. Yes, they are graceless.
Yeah, they're not. It's not quite like going to Victoria Park, but it's not much better.
Yeah,
either.
You might see a few there. Probably slightly better dental work. But anyway, what do you got for us to take us out, Jack?
Oh, look, someone's sledging the poor people from Mississippi. This was on social media. CSI Mississippi flopped because there were no dental records and everyone has the same DNA.
We're talking about the white population, I presume, Jack. The founding of the southern states of the United States is really, really interesting. And there's a lovely moment in a film, Gene Hackman film called Mississippi Burning. And there's a Klan. He as an FBI man, Gene Hackman goes to a Klan meeting and they scan the faces. There's the guys in Manchester on stage, and then they scan the audience watching it, and there's every broken head you can imagine. And it's basically because the southern states were essentially populated prior to the American War of Independence. They were basically Europe trash, actually, European trash, and they came to America as indentured labourers. And then once that period was up, it became available to them to take land. So the people they should have had the shared experience with were the black Afro-American slaves, but no, they chose to hate them instead. Very interesting. But anyway, CSI Mississippi, no dental records, and everyone has the same DNA. It's a very good line.
There's been all these Hamas protests at Harvard College.
Yes, I read about it. Yeah, nameless, basically.
This caught my eye. The demonstrators were directing their chants towards the Harvard administrators, and as the dean of the college, Rakesh Khurana, walked to his office in Harvard Yard, students not involved with the protest stopped him and requested a selfie. After that, he posed. The protesters entering the yard began to shout at him, Dean Rakesh, we call on you to use your privilege. We call on you to use your position to free Palestine. The protester with the megaphone said, and this went up on Twitter, and the response was, apparently courses on the dangers of magical thinking are not taught.
Tall order for Dean Rakesh there. It
sort of reminds me of that famous newspaper headline from a rural New South Wales newspaper during the First World War. We call on the Tsar to reconsider.
Yes. Well, there's a lot of that stuff still in commentary, Jack. I mean, if you ever see my advice to Anthony Albanese, you should probably pretty much ignore that. I urge. And when you see commentators writing, I'm telling a politician what to do, you just think, take it from me. Let's just don't waste your time and bother reading it. It will almost certainly be garbage. Well, there you go, Jack. Show number 50 out of the way. Put the bat down. Get on. You got to get the head down now and get on and get another 50. As will I. I always got the head down. Just watch you run in between the wickets. I'm not as quick as I used to be. But thank you very much for your time and over the last 50 episodes, Jack. And just a reminder, we did have quite a lot of listener stuff, which we will put into the show over the next couple of weeks. I do apologise. I have moved house, and it is a horrific episode for anyone who's done it, and most of us have. It's been a difficult time to get organised, but we're back now, so we do welcome your responses, or I am, and we do welcome your responses, and you can get hold of me on Twitter on @JackTheInsider. DMs are open, or if you want to have a chat with Jack, you can get hold of him on his Substack, which is
HongKongJack.substack.com. It will tell you you've got to subscribe, but you can subscribe for free.
Yeah, that's just you give your email address away. Your data will be used against you at some point in the future. Thank you, Jack, and we'll catch you next week, listeners.